Sociology Robot. Hello and welcome to the third video lecture on OCR A Level Sociology Paper 1, looking at Functionalism and Culture. Sociology is made up of a number of perspectives, and functionalism is perhaps the oldest of those perspectives. It has a fairly simple premise to it, that human beings have got certain basic biological needs, and that society has emerged to meet those needs. Now that sounds pretty simple, but some fairly important ideas flow out of those assumptions. It means that if all human beings have got the same basic biological needs, there are going to be some good societies and some bad societies. Good societies fit our needs and enable us to flourish, and bad societies work against our needs and they frustrate and oppress us, and we don't flourish in bad societies. Now, by societies here, we particularly mean cultures. So, functionalists are never really going to accept the idea of cultural relativism. They will admit that there are differences between cultures worldwide, but they will focus on what cultures have in common, which is a lot, and they will insist that cultures that most closely match our biological needs will be the successful cultures, and that we will occasionally experiment with other forms of culture, but if they don't meet our needs as well, then ultimately they are going to be unsuccessful. They're going to be inferior cultures. Most functionalists have a definite favourite when it comes to cultures, and that favourite is Western-style liberal democracies. Let's just break that phrase apart. By Western, we mean Western Europe, North America, Australia, the big cultures that produced the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th century, that led scientific innovation in the 19th and 20th century, and that also led the big reforms about human rights. We sometimes call these cultures liberal cultures because they are based on the idea of people being free, and they are also sometimes referred to as individualistic cultures because they focus on the happiness of the individual. In fact, the idea of Western liberal individualistic cultures could be summed up in that famous phrase from the American Declaration of Independence, that everyone is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those three things pretty much sum up what functionalists think a good society and a good culture should offer you. What else do functionalists believe about culture? Well, they believe it transmits the wisdom of the past to the present. It does this through traditions, and functionalists can be quite sentimental about traditional institutions, religion, the royal family, the nuclear family, the nation-state. They believe that sharing a culture creates what they call value consensus, an agreed sense of how things should be done, the boundaries of acceptable behaviour, the things that people should strive for. Value consensus is a very important idea in functionalism. Without value consensus, people end up living as strangers in their own community, not really being able to relate to each other, not having things in common with each other. This leads to a rather disturbed mental state, according to functionalists. That mental state is known as anomie, a word that literally means without norms, and refers to being disconnected from society. Functionalists believe that rises in anomie go alongside rises in destructive and self-destructive behaviour, mental illness, crime, drug taking, ultimately suicide. Now, because functionalists are big believers in value consensus and tradition being passed down from the past, they often have a fond outlook on things like religion. Even if they're not personally religious themselves, they see religion as having a good job of binding society together, like glue. However, functionalists do recognise that not all traditional institutions are valuable these days. They think something like trial and error goes on and that bad institutions eventually get ditched along the way. So we've gotten rid of slavery, and we've gotten rid of witch hunters, and we've gotten rid of the divine right of kings. Those institutions did not prove to have lasting value. But you'll notice that the change that functionalists look for in society is slow and gradual. They don't like big revolutionary changes. Functionalists believe that you can evaluate social institutions according to their manifest and latent functions. The manifest function is the obvious function of a social institution. The thing that we can see that institution doing. The manifest function of the police is to catch criminals. The manifest function of schools is to teach important knowledge and skills to children. Functionalists also believe in latent functions, and latent means hidden. So some institutions have functions for society and are doing a good job, but that function isn't obvious and perhaps isn't what it claims to be. For example, the latent function of religion might be to help people cope with stressful life events, births, marriages, deaths. Religion brings people together to commemorate these events and helps us cope with them. These events are sometimes referred to as rites of passage, occasions of great stress in the lives of individuals and communities. Now, most religious people don't think that that's what religion is for. They would say it's for helping you get to heaven. But functionalists would say, no, this is the latent function of religion. Can we point out some important functionalist researchers? Well, the most important historic functionalist is the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. Durkheim is one of the big three, along with Karl Marx and Max Weber, one of the founding fathers of sociology. Durkheim adds some very distinctive ideas to functionalism. The idea, first of all, of social solidarity, people's sense of being connected to a larger whole, and of social integration, the feeling of commitment to others, of having ties to other people, brought about by, he believes, collective ceremonies, weddings and state events and religious festivals, and collective identifications, like the national flag. A more recent functionalist is the American Talcott Parsons, who wrote a great deal in the 1950s and 1960s about post-war America. His book, The Social Structure of the Family, 1959, explores how children are socialized and adults have their personalities stabilized by belonging to a nuclear family structure of mother, father, and their own biological children. Parsons thinks that this is the best family structure that's yet been devised, and he argues that these strict gender roles, with the father as the breadwinner and the mother as the homemaker, help this family structure be successful. You'll immediately notice that some of these functionalist ideas seem a little old-fashioned, so let's try and evaluate functionalism. A strength of functionalism would be in its claim to be rooted in a biological understanding of human beings. If human beings all biologically have certain needs in common, then it means that all around the world they will have similar needs from society. And this means we can generalize theories about all sorts of societies and all sorts of cultures in different continents. We can judge those cultures and societies, we can compare them to each other, and we can say that some of them do a better or worse job of providing a situation in which human beings can flourish. Functionalism, therefore, is a very good comparative perspective. It's got a notion of what an ideal society would be like, and it can therefore evaluate existing societies. A criticism of functionalism, though, has to be that its notion of the ideal society as a Western liberal democracy is very much rooted in the post-war years in America, the world that Parsons was writing about. A world of, yes, great prosperity and security, but also of very strict gender roles, and a world very much based around the experiences and preferences of one cultural group, middle-class white Americans. This is one of the reasons why functionalism is often felt not to be successful at describing the more multicultural and diverse societies that exist in the 21st century. So we can summarise. Functionalism is a perspective rooted in a biological understanding of human nature and views society as having important functions to meet human needs. These functions can be manifest, which means obvious, or latent, which means hidden. When society meets human needs, then humans experience social solidarity and social integration. When they don't have their needs met, human beings live in an unhappy state. This is known as anomie, a state of disconnection from society, and all sorts of social problems can be blamed on this. Functionalism tends to support traditional institutions, gradual social change, and a traditional understanding of gender roles, for example. What about the exam? Well, functionalism is unlikely to turn up in Paper 1, Section A directly. But you could certainly see references to functionalism in the 20-mark essay question. For example, we've looked at a question that might be phrased, outline and briefly evaluate the view that culture is changing in modern Britain. And if you were needing to evaluate that view, then functionalism would be very useful, because you could point out that functionalists believe that change is only happening slowly, that traditional aspects of culture still have a lot to offer. They have latent functions, even if their manifest functions don't seem to be so obvious anymore. And so this would be a perspective that opposed the view that important changes are happening or should happen. We looked at the question about outline and briefly evaluate the view that cultural relativism is helpful for understanding society. And when you come to evaluate that view, functionalism would say that cultural relativism is perhaps not particularly helpful. It would point out that different cultures, in fact, have an awful lot in common. They have to, because human beings have a lot in common biologically. We share similar needs, and therefore our cultures are going to offer similar things. Functionalism would warn us not to be distracted by superficial differences between cultures. Again, it would urge us, look for the latent functions in cultural institutions, and you will see that many cultures that seem to be quite different are in fact doing similar things. We looked at the question, outline and briefly evaluate the view that norms in British society are changing, and that question also can be evaluated using functionalism. Functionalism would argue that norms change slowly, if they change at all, and that norms are important for social integration. Without sharing norms, we experience anomie. so functionalism would resist the conclusion that norms are changing or that they should change. Finally, we'll look to the question, outline and briefly evaluate the view that values in British society are shared by most people, and functionalism would strongly agree with this. Value consensus is a very important part of the functionalist perspective, and again, functionalists might say even if it doesn't seem that values are being shared, you need to look at the latent functions of social institutions, and then you might see that people who seem to believe in very different things, in fact, deep down, share an awful lot in terms of common values. Right, I hope that was a helpful overview of functionalism and culture. We'll move on to Marxism next. In the meantime, you might find my study guides useful. They're for sale over on Amazon, Socialization, Culture and Identity, and the combined book, Socialization, Culture and Identity with Youth Subcultures. You can find the details in the description. Sociology Robot.